Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Clara Bingham, the author of The Movement, How Women's Liberation Transformed America, 1963 to 1973. She's written 4 books and is a former reporter for Newsweek. Clara, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Evan.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Clara's book opens with a list of things that women couldn't do in 1963. No sports, no science, no lawyering or lawmaking, no credit cards, and no mortgages. But within 10 years, all that had begun to change. She says our fundamental understanding of how society should work had changed as rapidly as it had in all of at least American history. She says it's all too easy for us to take that change for granted, to assume that it was inevitable. But only by knowing the actual history, she says, can we improve ourselves today and make it so the quote from the Barbie movie, all problems of equal rights have been solved, becomes reality. So, first of all, Clara, when and how did you seize on those specific 10 years as being the key 10 years? Why not, let's say, 62 to 72 or 64 to 74? Why 63 to 73?
Well, I chose the bookends of the publication of the Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and Roe v. Wade in 1973. Other things that were really important happened in 63 and 73 as well. The President's Commission report on women came out in 63, which helped bolster the publication of The Feminine Mystique and led to the beginning, the founding of NOW, the National Organization for Women, which was in 1966. But also in 1973, the National Black Feminist Organization was founded, and they had a huge conference in New York, which was really the birth of Black feminism. And also Billie Jean King beat Bobby Riggs in the Battle of the Sexes in 1973. So I felt that those 10 years really marked the emergence, the birth of the modern women's movement, as what we call the second wave women's movement, because the first wave being the suffragists who got the vote. It took them 80 years, and we got the vote not until 1920. So this is 50 years later.
Yeah, I thought it was so interesting that you said the book is a natural successor to the book before this one, which was an oral history of 1969 to 1970. So I thought it was interesting how a sequel to you begins chronologically before the previous one does. It reminded me, I've never seen Star Wars, but it reminded me of the Star Wars thing where they did the first 3 movies, then went back in time. Uh, that book was focused on men. What does that say that even researchers into feminism find themselves writing about men?
Well, I fell into the classic trap when I wanted to write about the 60s and all the different movements for social change, which I touched on and witnessed to the revolution, by interviewing the people who were in charge. For example, Students for Democratic Society, which was the largest student group at the time, was run by Tom Hayden. So my first thought was, well, I better interview Tom Hayden, and which I did. And I'm glad I got to him before he died. But I didn't get to interview a lot of the women who did a lot of work for SDS, but who were anonymous. And so just as a lay historian, it was hard to find the women who were working in toiling away in the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the counterculture, who are even the drug dealers. Because one of the things I talked about in Witness was the emergence of the psychedelic movement. That was Tim Leary, not his wife. So their women were in very much secondary roles in all of those movements for social change. But because of that, they started their own movement, and the women's liberation movement really came out of the frustration that so many of those women who worked in Mississippi for SNCC, who worked, who organized many of the anti-war protests, and all of them so many of them came to the same realization at about the same time, that they were being treated by their comrades in arms who they were fighting for justice with as second-class citizens. So thus the women's liberation movement was born out of these two other, major movements. So I wrote about that in one chapter of Witness to the Revolution. And when I wrote that chapter, I realized that I was only scratching the surface of what in fact was the most lasting, for the largest number of people, movement that started in the 60s.
Uh,
And it was almost, movement is kind of a one way of describing it, but it was really more than a movement. It was a change of consciousness. It was a moment in the late 60s and early 70s when millions and millions of women suddenly woke up and understood that they needed to change their lives. And some of them were political, many of them weren't. But that's also, it's a harder movement to document in a way because it was so widespread.
it's so interesting you talk about the largest group, because it's at least half the people, right? What other
Right.
movement is half the people? Um, something in your book knocked my socks off. The Me Too movement. When you say that the Me Too movement impacted you writing this book, in my head, Me Too started like way before 2017 and 2016 and 17. In my head, I'm like, that's always been with us, at least I would have guessed 2012 or 14 or something like that. This is really recent history. How did that impact you as you began to explore the content of this book?
Well, Me Too did officially start earlier, but by 2017 was the moment when the New York Times broke the story about Harvey
Harvey
Weinstein.
Weinstein, yeah.
And that brought on a surge of other stories, and so many hundreds and hundreds of women came forward with their stories about workplace sexual harassment, and there just became this flooding moment of people feeling that it was safe to finally tell their stories. And whatever opinion you have about how far that went, and I have mixed feelings about how many people were slayed by it, and how extreme it got to be, but it was a very important moment in women's history. And I think that it also helped, whenever you have that in modern time, it's always, whenever you have a big change and you have a big moment, I think it always is a good time to look back, and because you have new perspective on women's issues now. And so to look back at where were we 60 years ago, and how did we get to where we are now with Me Too? So it just, Me Too spurred on my interest to look back at a time when women were doing this really for the first time in all of American history. And it also was an important reminder that it hasn't been that long.
Yeah.
We all have such, it's the world, the ecosystem of the news is now happening so fast that it's easy to have amnesia about our recent history. And so it's really only been 60 years that women have had, many rights at all.
Yeah,
And
my parents were both born before this, and certainly my, grandparents were, were well into the almost middle ages by the time 63 hit.
Exactly. And I was born in 1963. So
Yeah.
I'm that sort of first generation of women who benefited from all of these changes that took place. So I just wanted to catch the people who were at the forefront of this change before it was too late. Most of the women I interviewed were between the ages of 77 and 97.
Mm.
And B, remind readers that so much change has occurred in such a short period of time. And before 1963, women for thousands of years had not been able to advance. And that, that half of the population all over the world was in the same position of being second class citizens. So this wasn't just a movement, this was an earthquake that occurred. So I just thought now is really the best time to remember that.
Going through the book, it's essentially an organized sequence of recollections about different events that the speakers witnessed. Why do you find oral history so effective?
I think what an oral history does is it helps readers get a visceral emotional sense of what it was like to be a change maker. And and so I only interviewed people who were participants in this history, not historians who are analyzing it. And and also all history is personal, and this history in particular, it was a very personal history. And um, as the famous phrase of that era went, the personal is political, and therefore, an oral history, I felt, is the most authentic way and also the most captivating way to tell this history.
Not to criticize those who write narrative history,
No, of course not.
and 99% of the books we've done on here have been narrative history. Well, maybe not 90 because we've done a lot of academic books, but either way, what shortcomings do you find though? What should we keep in mind when we go through a work of narrative history? Just from your perspective, I thought it was interesting that you're into oral history. So when you read narrative history, meaning Clara, when you read it, what are you looking for, and what should we all take from that?
Well, when I read, I mean, I love narrative history, of course, and I call this an oral history narrative because I feel like there are two kinds of oral histories. There's the Studs Terkel version, where, the great famous Chicago-based oral historian who also had a famous radio show like yours, um,
Yes.
who would go out and interview lots of people. One of his famous books was called Working, and he interviewed probably hundreds to get down to what he chose of people to talk, and he talked to them about their jobs and how that affected their lives, and then he would whittle down each of those interviews into these perfectly constructed sort of transcripts of each story one after the other. What I've done here is more like reading a conversation. And one of the models I like to use as an oral history narrative is the book Edie. It's a biography, it's an oral history biography about Edie Sedgwick, who was a Warhol girl, written by Jean Stein and George Plimpton. And in that book, there is just a they seamlessly capture voice after voice describing who Edie was. And you almost don't know who's talking. It doesn't matter because you're so taken in by the story because there's just such an immediacy to everyone's testimony. So in my book, I wove together people who could tell me about the same event that they experienced, the same feeling they experienced. I, for example, interviewed 6 of the founders of Our Bodies, Ourselves. And each person came to that book and that experience in a different way from a different perspective. And between all of them, you get a holistic sense of how that book and the women's health movement started. So generally, an oral history doesn't fill in all the gaps. And it's also frustrating to write because you need people to tell you exactly what you need to know for the reader. And often I would interview people and have to ask them the same question 5 or 6 times. And that really would, and sometimes I'd get the answer I needed to tell the story, and sometimes I wouldn't. So often I would say, I would think to myself, it would have been just so much easier to write this than to need people to tell me what I needed to know.
Did you interview everybody who's in the book, or did you were you able to pull from other sources quotes from people who had passed on or who wouldn't agree to be interviewed again?
Um, Both. I definitely relied a lot on archives and much more with Witness to the Revolution. Almost all of the quotes are from people I met in person and interviewed. But I didn't have that. I didn't have that advantage with this book because so many of the big players had died. So for example, Polly Murray, who I consider the legal architect of the second wave movement, was long gone, and she had come of age in the 40s and 50s and was one of the elders of the movement. So was Betty Friedan. She had also died. So in the case of the women who died, I found myself in archives, feminist archives, at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard and the Duke Library, the Smith College Library, where they had miraculously conducted these very important oral history interviews with a lot of women back in the 80s and 90s. And also I interviewed, for example, Muriel Fox, who was one of the founders of Now, and she was 95 at the time, and she's now 97 and just wrote her memoir. It's amazing. Her memory was perfect. But at the same time, I was asking her to talk about things that happened 60 years ago. So luckily, the Schlesinger Library had also interviewed her in the 90s. So I was able to use both of my interview and the old one, and I did that with Gloria Steinem. I did that with many characters because it was better to get the old interviews often. Also, people who wrote memoirs, I relied often. I just wanted first person voice, and so I was just on the hunt for wherever I could find these women talking or writing about themselves in a personal way.
Speaking of gathering quotes, you worked for Newsweek for a while, which I'm curious about. I was one of those high school kids who subscribed to Time and Newsweek. I knew I wanted to be a news guy, so I was boning up even in high school on that stuff.
Those were the days.
Yeah, the mid '90s and the late '90s, they had a lot of reporters, and Newsweek and Time were big, thick magazines you got every week with really great articles in them. I read them on the subway almost every day. I'm curious how your reporting career started.
Well, I always wanted to be a reporter, so I worked for my high school and college newspapers, and then I worked abroad as a stringer, and then worked actually on the Dukakis campaign, which of course ages me. That was 1988. And as a press secretary, I was stationed in Tennessee during the general election, and I was always a political junkie. And so it was an exciting thing to actually go to the other side and be on the
Mhm.
inside of a campaign, and which I encourage anyone who's a political junkie to do. I tell all young people coming out of college, just find a campaign, go work on it, because you'll learn so much. I learned so much about politics and realized that I wanted to write about politics after that campaign was over, and managed by hook or by crook to land a job in the Washington Bureau of Newsweek in 1989 at the beginning of the Bush administration, Bush won. As you can see, Dukakis did not win.
Yeah.
But
That's well
and that
known.
was just
Yeah.
well known.
Yeah.
Remember the tank?
Yeah. Oh, I do. Yeah.
Yeah, he was really he was a wonderful man, but not a great candidate. Anyway, I got a job at Newsweek. I covered the Hill. I covered HUD, the Housing and Urban
Hmm.
Development Department. Um, Back in the day when Washington bureaus for news organizations were quite large, so that there were beats, that there was a HUD beat I don't know if there's so
Yeah,
much
like
of a
can you
heartbeat
imagine that
now.
right now?
Yeah,
I mean,
I
I
doubt it.
I can't fathom. Yeah.
And the Washington Bureau for Newsweek was big and filled with all sorts of interesting older people who I learned a lot from. And eventually I became a White House reporter, which was thrilling. And I was the junior Ann McDaniel, who was more senior and experienced than I was. The two of us were a team, and we covered the Bush White House, and I traveled around in the press pool on Air Force One, and went everywhere with George Bush and his team, and really learned the ropes doing that. And then, of course, there was this ironic moment when I was writing this book. And one of the important stories in the movement is the first class action ever for sexual discrimination in the workplace was at Newsweek. And 46 Newsweek women, staffers, sued the company, which then was owned by Katharine Graham, for sex discrimination. Their lawyer was ACLU, worked for the ACLU, and her name was Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is now a member of Congress representing Washington, D.C. And at the time, she had been a civil rights lawyer who took this case because it was such an obvious discrimination case. And the reason why was at the top of the masthead, where the editors and the writers were, every single person was a man. And then bottom of the masthead, every single person was a woman. So if you got a job at Newsweek in the 60s, 50s or 60s, you could just be a mail girl or clip girl or a fact checker if you got very lucky. And for example, Nora Ephron, the great writer and screenwriter, applied for a job at Newsweek, and the interviewer said, "What would you like to do here?" And she said, "I would like to write." And he said, "Oh, well, women can't." Oh, he probably said girls
Right.
can't write here. And he was right. Of course, Nora Ephron didn't last long, but I interviewed two of the women who were in that class action suit, Lynn Povich and Lucy Howard, for this part of the book, and they both were my bosses when I back in 1989 in the early 90s. And of course, at that time, I had no idea that there had even been a lawsuit. So there was my historical amnesia, and no one talked about it at the office. But of course, those two women and the 44 others who joined them in this case was very risky for them. They all thought they'd lose their jobs. They were shunned by the men at the office. Their bosses were furious with them. Um, they paved the way for me, for my generation to be able to go be a White House reporter, which would have been unheard of, just 20 years earlier.
Yeah.
So that experience was so eye-opening, and also such a cautionary tale, I think, for people now. Don't forget who your foremothers were. And so that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book.
In 2004, I'm really curious about this. You wrote an expose on the Air Force Academy rape scandal that made some waves in Vanity Fair. How did covering that shape your understanding of what women faced at the time and also historically?
That was really such a tough story. Um, by in 2004, women were just getting to this stage in the military and different parts of the military where they were able to advance. And at that stage, they still weren't allowed in combat positions, but they were able to be pilots. And because the Air Force was very technical and wasn't based so much on physical strength, women were able to advance there and farther than they were in some of the other military academies. And those pioneering students at the Air Force Academy in Colorado were horribly harassed, and there was a terrible rape culture. And it was almost a hazing culture. And I went there and spent a lot of time trying to get women to trust me to tell me their stories. And um,
You're
I
just like
published.
walking around campus, like
Yeah,
just with like,
well,
I mean, what exactly were you doing?
it was, I mean, this kind of reporting is a hard thing to do, but it helped because of my gender. But I knew who some of them were because some cases were bubbling through the courts, and through their lawyers gained access to them. And then of course one leads to the other, leads to the other. So I was able to get enough women to confide in me, and off the record, most of them. So I couldn't use all of their names. Many of them were still there. Some had left, so it was easier to talk to them. But getting them to tell me their stories was so important, and publishing it really exposed a culture at the Air Force Academy that had been secret and covered up for years. And Oprah magazine, the Oprah show ended up having us on the show. So some of the women I had interviewed came on the show and told their stories. So this was in the early 2000s, and the idea of sexual harassment and women being in new jobs that threatened men, that threatened the whole patriarchal structure of these very macho institutions, was really just beginning. And it all started in 1991 with Anita Hill, who came out against Clarence Thomas during his nomination hearings and told the story of his sexual harassment of her on the job in front of a panel of all white elderly male senators. And that really shocked the country as people watched those hearings avidly and realized, wow, there aren't many women in Congress, are there? And of course, after that, the year of the woman occurred, which was the election of 1992. So but from there to 2004, there was a huge change in the workforce, and the military was one of the last parts of that change.
Um, I have an embarrassing number of questions. I mean, I just wrote so many of them. We're a hair short on time, but I want to go through some of the book too, because there's such interesting history in here. Couple questions. One is the National Organization for Women, founded in 1966. What were some of the key issues that led Pauli Murray, Martha Griffiths, Catherine Easton, Betty Friedan, that they were pushing on that they believe could be impacted by having something called NOW, the National Organization for Women?
Pauli Murray came up with the idea of NOW because she had been involved for years in the NAACP, which had been fighting legally for Black citizens to get access to the workplace and fight discrimination on all sorts of levels. And she noticed that women needed that same lobbying group. They needed the legal expertise of lawyers who could fight the system and file suit. And the reason why they were able to fight the system was because back in 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, the word sex was inserted last minute in Title VII, which was the part of the Civil Rights Act that addressed workplace discrimination. And as a result of that, when the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, opened its doors for the first time in 1965, 1/3 of the discrimination complaints that came through were from women. And so what Betty Friedan, Pauli Murray, Catherine East, Martha Griffiths, who was an unsung, amazing congresswoman from Michigan, what they realized is what they wanted, their goal was to open up the workplace. And this is both for blue collar women and for white collar women. And that the workplace was absolutely shut down for women. At the time, newspapers had classified ads for jobs that were segregated. There was a women's section and a men's section. The women's section advertised for clerks, secretaries, nurses, teachers, and that was about it. And those were really, regardless of your education level, your talent, that was about it for women. So they broke through this enormous world of employment using now both legally, they had a legal arm, and politically to desegregate the workplace.
There's a name in the book of someone who I met, which was really cool to see. In I think 89 or 90, I was set up through my public school on the east side, 104th and Madison. I went to Central Park East too, and they organized a reading of a book with Faith Ringgold. She wrote a book called Tar Beach.
Amazing.
Yeah, and it was maybe the first time I was on a production, first of thousands of times, tens of thousands now. Um, but I met her and she was super nice, and a bunch of kids read her book Tar Beach together, and we were in a video which my mom said she's been trying to find on YouTube, hasn't been able to find it, but that's okay. At the time you're 6, 7 years old, you have no idea what that this is like a famous activist. Tell me, what did Faith Ringgold do that was so important?
Oh, I love that you met her. That's
Isn't that
fantastic. And of
funny?
course, she's responsible for your stellar career.
That's right. Yeah.
So
Well,
we owe it all
there's
to
no
Faith.
disputing she's one of the people who began it.
So Faith Ringgold is a fascinating character and an important character in my book. She was an artist. She just recently died. Actually, she had a very
Yeah, I
long,
saw that. Yeah.
full life and career. She was a Black woman who lived in Harlem, who for most of her career taught public school art and in public high schools in New York City, while she made her own art. And for many years, no one was interested in her art. No, and she just collected canvas after canvas in her various living locations, not able to sell them. Meanwhile, she was also a political activist, and she was a huge supporter of Shirley Chisholm, and she and her daughter Michelle Wallace, who I interviewed also, were part of a group of very brave women who fought the art establishment, all the big museums in New York, like Whitney and MoMA, who refused to have women artists in their collections. And the statistics are just stunning. I mean,
That is so crazy.
There were just no women. And I mean, there were few. Usually you had to be married to a famous artist or the child of a famous artist to be able to break through. Galleries didn't carry women artists either. So they were part of this important movement of women art activists who confronted the system. And at the same time, Faith was also dealing with the misogyny of the Black artists, male artists, who didn't want female artists to take their place, and whatever little ability they had to get into museums and galleries, which was very limited. So she had what this wonderful woman, Frances Beale, who I also interviewed, she had to deal with the double jeopardy of being Black and female. And it was a powerful position to be in, and a righteous one. And Faith Ringgold just took it on head on, and her art became very activist. And she, just a few years ago had a retrospective at the new museum, taking over the entire museum, 6 floors of her work, her tapestries. She was so prolific and creative. She had paintings, sculptures, tapestries, and now they sell for millions and millions of dollars. So it's such a happy ending, but it took 50 years of fighting for Faith Ringgold to get out there and change the system.
I wish I'd asked to borrow one or something like that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Who knew I was in the presence of royalty back in, I guess it was probably in 89, 90, somewhere in there.
She became a famous children's book author too.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. And
just
the
how
book, I
prolific
actually
she
got
was.
I got the book for my daughter, which is cool. It was like way above her head. It talks about all these things that a 2.5-year-old, or at the time, not quite right. Another person I want to ask about before we wrap things up here is Billie Jean King. When I read that she started the first women's pro tennis tour, I was like, wait, what? Like there wasn't a women's tennis tour? How important was that to have a space to compete?
Well, it's just I was happy to be able to include both artists and athletes in this book because so many women's history books about this period just focus mostly on politics and law, which were of course incredibly important. But I thought that showing what it took to be an athlete was something so many people could relate to, so many readers could relate to, and certainly personally I could as well as a budding jock in the 70s and 80s. But Billie Jean King, there were very few sports for women, just to start with. In high school in the 60s, women could only play half court basketball because the idea was it would just be too much running to have to run across the whole court. Women were not allowed to run long distances because doctors feared their uteruses could fall out. For example, I interviewed the first woman to run the Boston Marathon illegally in 1966, and she had to jump out of a bush, and her name is Bobby Gibb, and run the whole course in nurse shoes because there were no athletic shoes for women then. And she finished ahead of the two-thirds of the pack and became a legend. Well, so was Billie Jean King. And Billie Jean King was an incredibly talented tennis player. Tennis was one of the few professional sports at the time for women, though there were no student athletes who were women who could get scholarships. So you had to make it on your own and try to get through college working side jobs. And then once you were in the tour, women were paid about a fifth of what men were for the prizes. And so Billie Jean King, who was so good and so therefore could really bring crowds and understood that she had the ability to be a popular athlete. The reason being that men, of course, were just way better athletes and also better entertainment. So why pay women at all? And so she gathered this amazing group of women, many of whom I interviewed, Rosie Casals and Julie Heldman, um, and defied the USTA and pulled out, and they started their own tour. And they were supported by the Virginia Slims cigarette, which was a brand new cigarette that had just come on the market. They understood that this was, of course, a little hypocritical because none of them smoked and didn't
When I
want to
was a kid,
encourage it.
the Virginia Slims was an actual name of a tournament when I was a kid.
Yes, so
Yeah.
that was the tournament that the cigarette company sponsored them and marketed them very well, and they traveled the country and basically created this very popular new form of athletic entertainment, which was women's tennis. And Billie Jean King still is the queen of women's athleticism. She started the Women's Sports Foundation with Donna de Verona, who was a swimmer, and they really spearheaded women's sports.
What do we do with all this today? Dobbs has now happened. That's another interesting bookend to this, although, of course, that story is still being written. There are now fights over Title IX. There's a presidential candidate who is a woman who, at this point, the betting markets say she's got a good chance to win, or at least a better than half chance to win. Um, how do we take the heroes in your book and apply them to what we're seeing today in our discourse?
One of the heroes of the book is Shirley Chisholm, who ran for Congress for president in 1962. She was the first Black woman ever elected to Congress in 1968, and she was an incredibly brave, bold politician. And um, I see her as Kamala Harris's foremother, much more so than Hillary Clinton, much more so than Barack Obama, because the two of them have to deal with something that neither Hillary or Barack Obama had to deal with, which is being a Black woman. Shirley Chisholm faced a barrage of misogyny and and racism during her campaign for president, but she she faced it down with humor and bravery and didn't let anything touch her. And she was an incredibly important change agent. She didn't have a chance of winning. She knew that. But what she wanted to do was activate what was then a very alienated youth. This was during the anti-war movement and the Black Power movement. And of course, the establishment politicians were all white males who no one could relate to in that world, which is very similar to today, if you think of it. I mean, their Gen Z and the TikTok generation were not excited about Joe Biden. And now you see this uprising of engaged political Gen Z voters, which is so exciting. So I feel that Kamala Harris, who met Shirley Chisholm when she was growing up in California, and Kamala's mother was a very interesting feminist and ahead of her time. The Kamala Harris can learn a lot from Shirley Chisholm, and we all can.
Your book is dedicated to Diana Michaelis. I hope I'm saying that right. And you say it's in memory of Joan Bingham. Who are and were they, respectively?
Diana Michaelis is my daughter, who is now 23 years old. And Joan Bingham was my mother, who died when I was writing this book during COVID in 2020 at the age of 85. And so I see them as bookends to this book. And what my mother's generation, who suffered so much and changed so much. And my mother was involved in that tangentially in that change, created the world that my daughter is living in now. So I thought they were the right people to dedicate this book to.
Do you think you'll do another oral history, a narrative history? What do you think you'll do next? Is there a sequel that's crying out for you?
Well, there might be. I definitely, I have one in mind. I certainly want to do an oral history. I love the form. I love this way of telling history. And I feel that younger readers and students relate to it really well. And so I definitely want to write another one. And I'm thinking, what would the trilogy be? Evan, have any ideas for me?
Well, certainly today there's a lot to chew on, particularly with Dobbs and the Harris campaign and the Clinton campaign and how that's all wrapped into it. Seems like a lot of meat to chew on there with that.
That's true. That's true.
And
That's
Me Too
true.
also, right? Me Too also. So there you go. There's my idea. It's all yours. Clara Bingham,
Thanks.
yeah, you got it. Clara Bingham, the author of The Movement, How Women's Liberation Transformed America. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was such a fun conversation.
It was. Check out the book and her website, which is clarabingham.com. She's on social media at CY Bingham. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.